There we go. Okay, everybody ready to go?
Yep.
Yes.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Colleen Stovall, and I'm the Director for Programs and Events for AIA Miami and for the Miami Center for Architecture and Design. We're so glad you're here with us tonight. Our program's going to start in just a moment, and I'm just going to flip through a few slides of events coming up for MCAD and for AIA Miami. We have an exhibit at MCAD right now that'll be going through September, the best designs of 2020, which features the winners of the 2020 AIA Miami Design Awards. So come check that out in person. We will be doing some office crawls if anyone's interested. There's one at AECOM on September 23rd. And another one at Gensler on the 26th at 6 p.m. This one's virtual, and the one at AECOM is in person. This is about the film you're going to see tonight. There's a design and practice exchange between Miami, the Women in Architecture group between AIA Miami and AIA New Orleans. It's an online program on Friday, August the 27th and Saturday, August the 28th, which will be pretty interesting. The Emerging Professionals Awards is coming up October 1st. We'll have several book talks during our Archtober month, which is October. This one's on Cuban Modernism by Victor Dupuy and Jean-François Lejeune. And that's coming up October 21st at 6 p.m. And if you would, save the date for the AIA Miami Design Awards Carnival Celebration on the 29th of October, coming up this month. So that's all we have there. And right now I'd like to introduce the chairperson of the Miami Architecture and Design Film Festival Committee, Glenda Puente.
Thank you, Colleen. Hi, everyone. And we also need to have a save the date for our festival coming up in October. So this event is being carried out under the umbrella of the Miami Architecture and Design Film Festival, which is a committee within AIA Miami. We launched, the founder is Jason Tapia, who's an architect based in Miami. And we started it back in 2018. We had an event in October, as Colleen mentioned, for Architecture Month. We did it again in 2019, and obviously couldn't do it last year. But we did an event mainly tailored to students at the end of the fall. And we're also doing this event today in an effort to help promote the event and our comeback this year. If we can't do it in person, we'll do it virtually, but we hope to bring back the festival for the third annual event. And this year, the theme is going to be housing. And for that reason, we selected this short film today, City of Columns, which explores one of the few surviving Nagaya neighborhoods in Osaka, revealing how the early modern Hashira Masochi brought standard dimensions to residences, neighborhoods, and the city as a whole, a form of standardization whose traces can still be found in the contemporary city. We will have a conversation after the short film. It's only 10 minutes. And I want to introduce the panelists and also thank them for being here today. We have Carrie Penabad, who's an architect based in Miami, principal at Cure Penabad, and also was Associate Dean and Director of the Bachelor of Architecture program at University of Miami. So welcome, Carrie, and thank you for joining us tonight. We also have Stephen Fett, who is also a colleague of ours at University of Miami. He's a lecturer and assistant director at the Center for Community and Urban Design and principal of his firm, Stephen Fett Architecture. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us tonight. And it's actually good morning to Rafael Balboa, who's joining us from Japan. He's the co-founder and director of Studio Wasabi Architecture, and also a senior researcher at the Kengo Kuma Laboratory at the University of Tokyo. So thank you, Rafael, as well for joining us from very far away. After the film, we'll have a conversation with the panelists, and I'll maybe get it started with a couple of questions, but to the audience, please feel free to join that conversation, turn your camera on if you wish, and you can share with us your insight or ask questions if you have doubts about certain topics or interested in a particular topic, and we can talk about it. I'll also ask the lecturers, the panelists to speak a little bit about their connection to Japan, so you get a sense of that right after the film. I think with that, I can, Colleen, just ask you to get it started. Thank you.
つけてしまったとこもあるかもわかりません。それやったらもう針金。これなんかはね。ね、外れる。まあ、そこを適当にして、はい、でくるくるっとしていただいて、オクラのどこでも廊下のところへ出していただいて、でこれも全部外すんですね。はい、これと。 がなかったのかな。はい、できました。まあ、あれあれ。
Thank you, Colleen. We will now start the conversation. Like I said, I want to ask our panelists here, welcome them once more, just to share a little bit with us about their connection to Japan or what's their experience. Carrie or Stephen, Rafael, whoever wants to get started with that, feel free.
Well, I think in the case of Carrie and I, it's very similar. Our experiences with Japan have been through the eyes of professors at the School of Architecture and University of Miami, leading a summer program called the Open City Studio that really has traveled globally, but has had a fixation on Japan for the last 15, maybe even 18, 19 years, leading groups of students there over the summers. And, you know, each time that we go, we sort of, you know, scratch a little off of the surface and understand it a little bit deeper. And it's, you know, I would say so fascinating a place that it constantly, you know, keeps our interests piqued.
And maybe I would just add, I agree with Steve, obviously. Our engagement started as an academic one, and I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to go to Tokyo, because it completely reframed the way that I understood cities and architecture. And I think that was an invaluable insight, and it continues to inspire the way I think about my work and my practice today. And Stephen and I and Adib Pure, another colleague at the university, we're currently working on a publication documenting pencil building, which is a particular vernacular type that, or contemporary vernacular type that we found in Tokyo that was really unique to Tokyo. We've been documenting it and recording it, and hopefully we'll release a publication soon.
And we hope to convince Raphael to join us in that pursuit.
Yes, well, I agree with you. First, thank you for the invitation and greetings from Tokyo. And thank you, Glenda, for organizing this. And happy to be with Carrie and with Steve, which are very dear academic colleagues and also friends here in Tokyo. I agree about the complexity of the cities. It's true that, for example, in my case, after being 1/3 of my life, which is 16 years, here still I have more questions than answers. Obviously, there are some factual things that we can even talk about now, probably in the using this platform, the movie, as a pretext to discuss some features of the Japanese house. But still, the complexity of this, not only of the city, but of the culture, I think it's something that it starts to unfold to you really gradually. It doesn't unfold to you at first glance. It really takes time. So I think that's something that engaged you and is very fascinating about Japanese culture to start with, no?
Right. So thank you everyone for sharing a little bit about that. One of the first questions I want to pose to you is about the theme of modularity that was very present in the film, and it's at the root of the Nagaya, showing how it uses the tatami mat as a unit of measure for their rooms, but also it goes beyond the dwelling unit and into the city block and the scale of the neighborhood. And how does modularity influence Japanese architecture today? Or is this tradition beginning to get lost in sort of I think this is something that happens everywhere, right? The big development happening in all the cities, I think, across the globe, and probably that smaller scale gets lost. But what is your opinion?
You want to go for that maybe first?
Sure, Carrie, or I can, I would say just briefly to kind of introduce the topic. I think in a way, I would say more present than at first it might appear. And yet also ultimately, as you mentioned, Glenda, kind of influenced by the sort of globalization, global trends of kind of disposable consumption. I mean, the Japanese are, in a period, let's say, of great openness, and a lot of influences are being manifest there. But at the same time, there are, maybe speaking specifically to some of the things that we saw in the movie, this idea of sort of standardization, as you mentioned, the tatami mat, the soji, and really this sort of intercolumnar kind of spacing that occurs in these traditional Japanese houses, have, I think, endured contemporary construction. For example, the contemporary real estate markets still use basically the dimensions of the tatami as a way to sell real estate. One jo, as it's called, is essentially one tatami. And if you were to, rent an apartment in the city, you would see these sort of dimensions still being used. And in fact, most contemporary homes, let's say that are built recently, will still have a tatami room with the tatamis of the same dimensions that you might have seen 300 years ago, depending on the region. Other things are sort of very modular too. You know, this sort of temporariness, or bring the tatami as you travel from place to place, as you rent. Kitchens are usually left without appliances. The fittings are sort of prepared for you, and then you kind of bring your own things in. Bathrooms are often very sort of modular and installed. And, you know, in fact, the real estate market in Japan is one that is very ephemeral too. The land is really what comprises all the value, and homes, in fact, are sort of disposable. So in that sense, they are systems of standardization are actually still quite effective, but you know, it doesn't maybe appear in the same way that you know, the sort of poetic dealings of the movie you know, display.
Yeah, well, Carrie, maybe you can.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, we're just adding to what Steve is commenting, that all this system of standardization, of course, is the response of the fast urbanization that was experienced eventually in Edo period, in Edo, which is Tokyo, basically from 1603 until 1868, and this is 265 years when Japan was ruled by this group of samurais, the Tokugawas, and they had this policy called sakoku. And at that period, of course, with rapid growth and urbanization, they had to come up with certain standards. But standardization came way before Edo period. That's something that we need to take into account. It's something that was, as Steve was pointing out, varying from region to region. And I think that speaks a little about this kind of local pride that the Japanese were always trying to foster in their societies. And that was basically because if you would have a tatami, for example, which was produced in one region, you wouldn't be able to use it in a different area or in a different city. So that would only foster locality, or just the craftsmanship would be used in the local areas, which I think was also very clever, you know, in that aspect. One more thing that I would like to add is that the column itself should be seen as the origin of Japanese architecture, because basically, if you look at the Kojiki, which is the main, it's the book, was basically the cosmogonic book of Japan. But there are two books here, which is Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. So these two books talk about these two first deities, which were dancing around a column. And that was the first two deities which created these islands, which we call Japan, according to the mythology. So there is something even masculine, I would say, if we refer about the presence of the column, the phallic, I would say in that sense, probably presence of the column, and also how it creates a grid or a repetition, and all the lifestyles that are happening in between these columns. No? The movie starts with these big columns in the city, and we see how it starts to reduce to the smaller scale, which is more domestic. And I think this is very beautiful, because still that grid system exists all around the Japanese culture.
Yeah, I might piggyback on some of those comments in the sense that, well, first of all, seeing the film gave me a yearning to be in Japan again. I will say that. But at the same time, it reminds me of some of the lessons. You know, I've been struck in my visits to Japan, but the way in which the Japanese manage innovation and tradition. And in the sense that, you know, in the West, we have, I shouldn't say this, but I believe we have more anxiety about these things. In the sense that I think we build, or at least in the West, to say generally speaking, we built in masonry, right? And so our historic buildings tend to last, in fact. And so they're quite different than the building traditions of Japan, which of course are a wooden tradition. And so the wooden tradition doesn't have the capacity to last the way that the masonry buildings in the West do. So in a way, a building has to be continually rebuilt. And so in a way that what is new is in fact rooted on traditions that, you know, span hundreds of years, but at the same time are built today. So I find that the Japanese have a way of embracing innovation and tradition simultaneously. And for me, it came across in the film, notwithstanding obviously that the landscape of Tokyo is radically different today than the film, or Osaka, than the film depicts. But it reminds me that with modularity, one need not abandon craft either. So, you know, the hand doesn't have to be abandoned in our desire to produce modularity in a contemporary society. So that's one thing that sort of it brought me to think about, because oftentimes today when we think of modularity, or we always think of kind of mechanized productions, which of course are valid and certainly necessary, especially when we are building, you know, the sort of megalopolis. Perhaps you could argue that the speeds in which mechanized modularity occurs may be the only option, but maybe it's not the only option. You know, when we think about, you know, developing countries, or, you know, landscapes outside of the kind of dense megalopolis, the idea of rethinking how craft can play a role, like natural materials, the standardization of timber, you know, can play a role in modularity as well, is I think something worth thinking about.
Great, thank you for those comments. Just what Rafael mentioned about the sort of the rapid city growth, and also speaking about modularity, maybe in that light, Carrie, that you began to expand on. I wanted to ask if this was a result of the rapid growth, sort of this standardization, modularity, is that something that you think could be the solution for what we have coming up, which is also a major boom in urban areas in terms of population, expecting by 2030, 70% of people in the world will be living in cities. And us here in Miami, such a metropolis, will most likely see those numbers in real life. What are your thoughts on that? There's, like you were saying, Carrie, with you know, masonry construction. From my experience, I don't know that many buildings are prefabricated, or that modular construction is something that happens as much as maybe we would like in Florida. I think at the end of the day, is the typical just block construction. Why do you think that is, or do you see the potential of prefabrication and a module kind of happening and maybe introducing itself? Do you know of any projects maybe that are using this type of construction or method here in Miami?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Miami we're much closer to Latin American traditions, you know, in the sense that we're probably, I mean, I don't know if I can say this emphatically, but I think we're one of the few large cities in America that predominantly built in concrete, and as opposed to, let's say, steel frame construction. And I have a feeling that there's multiple reasons why that's the case. On the one hand, it's a tectonic, you know, kind of the question of assembly, right? Steel in a subtropical environment needs to be protected. It needs to, you know, in a way that, for example, masonry doesn't. So there's some climatic reasons why this might be the case, but I also think there are cultural reasons why this is the case. Because if we think about Miami's building traditions, you know, they're quite, I mean, we're a young city, certainly. So it begins in wood. You know, we had a sort of very short period where the city built in wood, which I guess is closer, for example, to metal or steel assemblies, which are the ones that are more commonly associated with modular systems. And then it abandoned it for obvious reasons, because of hurricanes and the like. And so this displaced it. with masonry, but there's also the kind of cultural connections to Spain and the Mediterranean and even Latin America, which connects us to those traditions, and those are real and true. So I think there are some people beginning to investigate the idea of modularity in Miami. I think maybe at the domestic scale more readily than at the larger scale. I think it's really a moment of experimentation. And so it's difficult to compare it with the one in the film, because when I see the notion of modularity in the film that you asked us to watch, I think it's born out of a very long-standing tradition, which comes from a kind of traditional Japanese architecture that is being developed for hundreds of years, which is not only affecting, the room, the assembly of the room that I think Steve talked about earlier with the tatami, but that kind of modular system is rooted in the wooden construction, which then generates certain dimensions for the lots, which then influence certain dimensions for the block, and then ultimately the street. So it's this unbelievably rich layered system. I think ours at the moment would be different because in a way the system already exists. And so we would be working within it in a more, I think in a more experimental way. I think that's what's happening at the moment. But I don't think it's pervasive yet, because the industry that still dominates in South Florida is concrete. It's masonry.
I think it's good to understand the context of Japan at the time that these row houses in Osaka were built. Japan's history is sinuous, I would say. It's marked by these long periods of isolation, followed by periods of openness and exchange with other countries. Perhaps the most famous period of this openness is the Meiji Restoration in the second half of the 19th century, which follows the Tokugawa era that Rafael was mentioning earlier. And it introduced Japan to a lot of Western arts and crafts, including architecture. But it also, I guess, ends up eliminating a kind of class system, a division between, let's say, the samurai and the commoner classes. And that in turn sort of commoditizes real estate, effectively turning a large population of renters into landowners. And this sort of rapid growth, which Glenda, you've mentioned a few times, which leads to this sort of standardizations, extends to the era when these Nagaya were likely built. So, to accommodate this sort of enormous growth spurt, the standardization was advertised to help reduce costs, increase efficiencies. But I think, as Carrie is sort of alluding to, it's also should be noted that, during this Tokugawa era, during this kind of feudal time, when the emperor is out and the shogun are in, that Japan was hardly a barbaric culture. Craft and culture flourished. And so when called upon to produce, I think the country was ready for it. If we translate this to Miami, which is, I guess, the question, or other parts of the world, and ask if Japan is, some kind of harbinger of what to expect in our next population boom, I want to, but I can't quite make that leap because, well, for a number of reasons. I think modernism has always made the promise of efficiency and modularity. And indeed, we do, have standardized building elements, the 2x4, the CMU block, the 4x8 sheet of plywood. But in the end, it's sort of only the thickness that is typically designed for. Almost in all cases, these materials are covered and sort of therefore forgotten, unlike the shoji, unlike the tatami. As a practicing architect, I rarely see modularity devoid of some form of customization. And these proprietary systems, which I think bring the promise of simplicity, that are developed, drop ceilings, acoustical tiles, prefabricated flooring, they're generally not reusable. And so you tend to need to use, these clips or this patented system And if you want to reconfigure a room, you end up demolishing the entire ceiling and starting over, and it's disposable and it's sort of cheap. And in many ways, the economy is kind of built on that model, that we throw things away rather than repair them, let's say. There's a really strong element of reuse and longevity in the Japanese examples. And as I mentioned, the tatami and some of these dimensions, are still used today. The fact that Japan is also an island, I think, helps force to, bring these environmental consequences to light. And concerns of waste and recycling are maybe more present. But if there's something to be gleaned, perhaps it's the fact that we will all be forced to reduce waste, and standardization is certainly potential and positive variable to that end. I guess those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, just commenting also, and agreeing with both of you, with Carrie and Steve. You mentioned about the refinement of the techniques, and I think for the proper implement, the question here was what Glenda was posing here, or trying to understand if there is a way to implement this kind of thinking in other cultures or something different. And I think all this has to do a lot with disaster, especially all this standardization or modulation of systems. If we observe after the war, of course, most of the prefab houses started to be produced in those places where there was population in need for new housing. And in the case of Japan, we have to understand that fire was one of the biggest issues to deal with, because you would often have areas which would be completely destroyed by fire, and they had to come up with this system where you could just bring your things quickly and just to run away with this. No? So that's one thing, that disaster would probably trigger, or is always triggering, new ways of constructing or of doing things. But then there comes the other question, which is the lifestyles that happen in these houses. In the case of Japan, of course, it's very different the way people live in Japan. Of course, the floor is much more active. The lack of furniture is also something that is completely opposite or different from the Western way of living. Basically, the floor is very flexible. So the most valuable thing in your house is going to be your tatami, basically, because that's the thing you would carry with you. You can usually flip it every 5 years, or between not more than 10 years, but you can flip it, and it has this kind of reusability, as Steve is pointing out, which is completely different from the way we live in the Western world. Even I think in the movie, it's showing something which is these blinds, which are with straw. That thing is called Sudari. And here I want to cite or to point out Mitamunetsuke. Mitamunetsuke talks about the Sudari Complex. And the Sudari Complex, it's a sociological approach, at least in his point of view, about how Japanese live. And that means that Sudari Complex, he refers to seeing without being seen. And that is something very Japanese, these lives of these ways of living in Japan. If you can see this kind of a very privileged position where you are seeing but not seen, it's something that you would observe a lot in Japanese houses. And probably is very different in the way we live in the Western world. Regarding the refinement of the techniques, definitely Japan, we have two different constraints. First, as Steve is saying, this insular condition plus topographical condition, and we have 2/3 of the island it's a mountain. So basically, we have a lot of trees here, and that was the main resources that they started to use. Simply with the time, they started to refine this kind of techniques. Also, we have to think about the earthquakes. In Japan, we have a lot of earthquakes, and going back to this idea of the disasters, of course, these houses needed to withstand all the shake of the earthquake. So they use no nailing. Basically, these elements, they kind of move, or they can be dismantled, especially for tea houses. It was typical to move the daimyos or the landlords. They would move their tea houses sometimes from one garden to another, for example. So this replaceability is coming also for this refinement of the technique. which is linked to the natural resources, of course. As we were commenting, if we want to implement something, we need to understand first the climate conditions that we have in each city, and then just try to start to make use of them, along with all this knowledge of the craftsmanship, ideally, no? If there is such a culture.
Thank you to the three of you. I think you brought forth a lot of other very interesting topics and insights. And like I said at the beginning, if anyone in the audience wants to add to anything that's been said or has a question, please feel free. I know that if you signed up to watch this film, it's because you have a particular interest in some of these topics, or maybe some insight. You might have some experience and insight yourself. So we would love to hear that. We'll give it a minute, see if anyone from the audience wants to come forth. If not, I have a couple other questions, but. Okay, maybe then another round. Will you start to talk about climate, Rafael, in the previous question? And that was something also that I found very interesting with, well, you've brought forth the idea of sort of earthquake and crisis and having to move fast. So the ability to move things, it's something that has made the design of the house something that's you can transport and take with you. But I also like, you know, I appreciate very much the scene where the woman is asking the man to remove the screens and taking them to the storage, because they were sort of changing, like the house changes with the season. So I just wanted to ask if you can speak a little bit more about that. We don't have drastic changes of seasons here in Miami. But I don't know if maybe Carrie or Steven could speak about that, or ways that we can implement a little bit of that idea of changing the house, changing the home to better adapt to perhaps the changes of light or the rain. I mean, we do have a little bit of a temperature change, but not so drastic, but maybe in response to that.
You know, one thing I take from the film is this idea, and not just a film really, I mean about experiencing Japanese architecture, is this notion of layers of privacy, of threshold, of engagement with the landscape. You know, I grew up in the north where there are dramatically distinct seasons, and it's true, Miami is generally thought of as you know, having only summer, but actually, I think we do have seasons. You know, I was thinking about this recently. I mean, I've been in Miami 20 years, and it's only like 2 years ago I realized that I really like April. And I've come to know it and love it, and it has far more breezes. You know, there's other months that the sun is set a bit higher in the summer, and that affects, you know, the effectiveness, let's say, of overhangs. December through March, as we know, are delightful. But I think most Miamians tend to set their air conditioning to 72 and forget about it because, you know, again, electricity is relatively cheap. But, you know, as that changes, I think a more subtle approach taken through design might be welcomed. And I think this is where architecture has something to say about it, to effectively kind of solve problems through architecture rather than to solve them through technology or through systems, let's say. And so perhaps this idea of layering, of screening, can be introduced to allow us to, you know, revisit life without a sort of uniform air conditioning setting. And, you know, we're not going to probably eliminate the possibility of, you know, enjoying, you know, the sort of dog days of summer without it. But I do think that there's if we design to the landscape, if we design to the climate, that we can make an impact in that. And I think that Japan has many examples that we can look to. And furthermore, as we urbanize, as we densify, let's say as single family houses maybe become lots for 2 houses and so on and so forth, this notion of privacy becomes a more and more important factor, allowing us to kind of live and yet be private within the context of a city. I mean, walking through streets of Osaka or Tokyo, one realizes that houses are actually relatively kind of internally focused. And the engagement with the street is, you know, not so evident, let's say, and yet they're highly urban. You know, you couldn't ask for a sort of better walking city. You know, it kind of checks all the boxes that we look at of things that make great cities, and it does it in a very different way. So I think this layering, the screening is really, you know, key in a way to understanding these kind of climatic questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the, just to build on your point, Steve, I think what the film revealed was I mean, obviously not only the flexibility of the modular system, but the kind of openness to the outdoors, right? Your ability to being somehow in connection to the exterior, and maybe even accept the realities of weathering. You know, I think weathering is embraced and accepted, and I think that's also a very different phenomena than, let's just say, Miami, you know, where everything needs to feel new, look new, be sleek, and, you know, any signs of weathering or aging in the fabric or in the people becomes a major source of anxiety in a city like Miami. So, but, you know, I will offer one other alternate reading of the way in which the house responds to the environment, because as you were speaking, Steve, it reminded me of a great essay that I read the first time that I went to Japan by Venturi and Scott Brown, and it's entitled Two Naifs in Japan. And when I read it, in it, they make an argument. This was written after their first travel to Japan. And they actually made the argument that the architecture itself, particularly, for instance, in Tokyo, you will enter some of these houses, and in Tokyo, it gets very cold, actually, quite cold. I mean, from a person that is raised in the Caribbean, I mean, it's very cold. And yet you enter houses that have wood screens and the paper, you know, soji screens, and you ask yourself, well, this doesn't feel like a house that is actually responding to the climatic conditions because it's quite cold. And so what Venturi speaks about, and Scott Brown in this essay, is that it's not just the house. It's actually the entire cultural framework that gives way to that traditional house. So the house itself actually didn't really respond. It could be quite cold in the winter, but it was the kimono, which is different in the summer from the winter. The winter kimono is very, very thick, and it has the obi, and you know, when you kneel, and I forget the name, Rafael, of it's like where the fire sort of burns in the interior of the house, or the coal. So what he brings, or what they bring into the conversation, is that the architecture oftentimes is not the one that is actually kind of responding to the climatic conditions, but in fact the architecture is, I won't say static, but it migrates, and it doesn't really transform very much, even when it's transplanted to a colder climate. And it was really all the artifacts of daily life, the cultural artifacts of daily life, that were actually responding to those conditions, which I think is something very, very different than we would ever conceive of in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree about this. There is a romanticization of the Japanese house in that sense. Usually Japanese houses, if you happen to live in some of these very traditional houses, which are disappearing gradually, of course, because of the material, basically. And you will realize that a lot of that lifestyle happening inside has to be supplemented by other kind of devices. For example, what you are commenting is called the kotatsu. So it's a low table and it's heated. So you just enter, just put yourself inside, because basically the house didn't provide the enough comfort, and you have to deal with these extreme weather conditions in Japan, in the case of Japan. We have to understand, I would put on the table here probably the comments of Georges Tissot, who talks about the windows and especially about the optical apparatus, because we have to remember this movie was created by the Windows Research Center, which I happened to see emerging. It was created by Chiba Lab in 2007, probably. And eventually it became the research institute. And I think this optical apparatus is very, seeing the house as an optical apparatus from the frame of Georges Tissot, it's basically a system, no? So it has these layers which are very soft, as Steve is pointing out, but it creates also this feeling of oku, which we call in Japanese, Fumihiko Maki, prominent Pritzker Prize. He used to talk about this kind of innermost spaces you are transgressing, or you are entering to the spaces. So it creates certain kind of romanticization, obviously, in visual aspects. Even, for example, I think when Gropius came to Japan and he visited Villa Katsura, he was completely in love, of course. But it was very modern in a way, that all this kind of system of joineries and all these kind of things. But this romanticization, of course, falls completely apart at the moment that you start to leave these spaces. So yes, there is some kind of lack of responsiveness in this kind of subtleness of the Japanese house. I totally think it's correct. Eventually, design-wise, I think it's desirable to have a project or a product, because at the end, the architecture is a product that exists in the market, which is modular, but also is flexible. Something that I was commenting at the beginning with you. It's the contour of the Taylorism. I mean, it's not tailor-made for you, but still it allows you to any user to at least adapt this kind of elements, in this case, the screens, no? And one more thing to comment is about what Steve was commenting about the city. The city, we often refer to Tokyo as a city of villages, like a collection of villages. Actually, Tokyo is the same case with Osaka, not to say also with Kyoto, of course. It's really it works more like small villages, basically, in terms of scale or the sense experience of the city, no?
Thank you. Great comments. There's a question in the chat that I wanted to read. It says, the row house with a private courtyard is a beautiful building type not typically seen in the US. What can American architects do to promote this building type in spite of zoning regulations that typically outlaw them?
Maybe I would even add to that. I think zoning codes, that's the crux, right? And a lot of times it's also the developer, let's say, or not necessarily the developer, but the code often sort of forces you into a certain decision. And carving out a nice courtyard, as the question is asking, might come at the expense of square footage, for example. And so very often decisions are then made, well, square footage is more important than that sort of outdoor space. And I mean, I don't know, what the right answer is there. I think, I do think it might come back to, in time, this idea of environmentalism as well, which sees the virtues perhaps of the courtyard, of cross ventilation, of rooms that aren't too deep, of layers of spaces that can be used in different times of the year, solar orientation and so on and so forth. And so, in the same way, maybe that 15 to 20 years ago, we lamented about our zoning codes, we have seen some changes over time. And I think as architects, we need to advocate for these things as well. And our planning departments also are being, I think this is actually one of the, great virtues really in a legacy of the University of Miami School of Architecture is that a lot of those planning roles are being filled by, grads who have a kind of understanding and awareness of urban design. So, maybe slow but sure, there's enough pressure and enough good arguments to see things this way, but in the end, I suppose the answer, as it has been so famously said by many, many people, the answer to all of your questions is money. Meaning, if you don't understand something, that you trace it back, and it's probably an economic decision that's being made. So, maybe we all need to design some great courtyard houses that drive the cost of the market up, and then others will replicate.
Carrie, you're on mute.
I do that at least twice a day. I noticed the question came from Aki. Aki, it's nice to not see you, but to see your name. I was thinking about it because there was a time where actually the row house was a prevalent building type. Maybe not so much with the court, but oftentimes, certainly in the Northeast, in the 18th and maybe 19th century, as this kind of intermediate middle scale urbanism that was not a detached single family residential, but the city, but was not necessarily a high rise, right? I think I agree with you that in Miami, obviously, there are far less of these party wall typologies, but I think it's just a byproduct of the way in which our city, in my opinion, developed, where again, we're a very, very young city who had a mass exodus to the suburbs immediately at the moment where the city could have maybe densified. And so we're a city that really housing is really at the extremes, so the high-rise condominium or the detached single family home. So all of these alternate housing typologies, which might fall in the middle ground, of which the row house is one of them, is in essence sort of, let's say, absent in terms of, let's say, the kit of parts of the city. But I do believe that it is emerging, and maybe because of what Steve was saying earlier, it's really just a matter of circumstance where these once single family detached residences, just by virtue of the added population and the kind of pressures for development, are needing to change, whether they will adopt the kind of zero lot line, row house. I think that will depend on the municipalities, but I think in the coming years, it will be up to us, really, the generation of architects building this new city, to really push back on this and look for these intermediate models, which, if you think about it, most of Tokyo, you think Tokyo is the metropolitan area is probably about 30 million, maybe, or maybe 30, 31, 32 now. You think about it as one of the densest places in the world, and yet the majority of the fabric in that city is single family residential. I don't know if most people are aware of that, and that really was staggering for me. Of course, it's a detached single family residential house, but it's incredibly densely, sort of parceled. So the amount of land surrounding the house is far less. But in general, that city, that megalopolis of 30 million plus, is predominantly single family detached residential. And when it actually gets denser in terms of the housing, it rarely, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are moments in Shinjuku and others where you do see the sort of high rise, but predominantly you're not going to see a fabric that goes much more than 6 or 7 stories. So it's really remarkable, Tokyo, because for me anyway, it has a kind of traditional platting system that you associate, with small parcels and relatively, small buildings, sort of densely articulated, the way you would find in a traditional city. but yet with a completely modern architecture because of what Rafael was saying earlier, because of its continual rebirth and rebuilding. So you get a completely modern architecture with a kind of traditional platting, which causes great, like just a very unique urban experience. So I'm optimistic, Aki. I'm optimistic that in the coming years, we will be able to introduce, more richer housing types in that middle ground as the city densifies, as our city densifies.
Sounds like Aki has a battle going with the zoning department.
Yeah, well, I don't know much about the case of Miami, but it really raises the question of who owns the city and who makes the city at the end. I mean, obviously, we make the city and the city makes us, but in terms of factual statements, we know that, we remember, I don't know, Gordon Mataclar talking about the city as profitopolis. It's all about money, as Steve was saying. And in the case of Japan, it's not the exception, of course. Nagayas, as a typology of houses, responded to a very specific moment of history, which of course they are tending to disappear. You still can find in certain areas of Tokyo, but the majority of the city is mainly densifying, especially something that we call LR, or land readjustment. So basically in the streets facing wider, in buildings or properties which are facing wider streets, the trend is that real estate developers are fusing many of these small plots, and they have the right to go much higher. So you can see this kind of belt around certain areas, and inside you can see like very low houses. That's something that a friend calls a bad haircut architecture, like my hair, like short here and long here, and it's a little bit like that, the city organized. So at the end, it's a big question what you were pointing out. I mean, how can we bring back, and that's a responsibility for this generation of architects, how to respond or how to create this kind of urban qualities that we can find, for example, in the Nagayas, which is you could see people talking one to each other. It was a very one house was almost the extension of the other house, and that created a very unique sense of community. So that's something that we would like to have again in cities. No, at the end, that's why we created cities, to live in community, in society. So that's the origin of living in a city. No.
I totally agree, and I think that missing middle, I don't know if it was Stephen or Carrie that mentioned, called that, that's I think really what creates community. It's that type of, the row house, maybe even the duplex, the triplex, the multiplex, all these typologies that Miami sort of missed out on because of that super rapid growth too, but it went directly into the high rise, or maybe mid-rise, high compared to other cities, but high rise for us, a 30-story building, it's pretty high rise here. So it's also the fact that we somehow ended up with the lot being 50, because as Carrie mentioned earlier, we did start to build with wood, and that was the dimension, 25 feet initially, and then grew to 50, and that's what the lots ended up being. But in 50 feet, if you have, just going back to Aki's question, if in 50 feet, if you have 5-foot setbacks on each side, then you're down to 40, then cutting a courtyard out of that width becomes a little bit problematic when you still have a setback of maybe 20 feet or something in the rear that you have to comply with. So you can't really grow lengthwise, and then to lose the courtyard, it becomes also kind of, it's maybe not just the zoning regulations, but also the inability to kind of work out the floor plan. And yes, as Stephen said, sometimes comes down to money, or maybe just not the awareness about this typology because we don't have it. So I think just as architects, what we could do is bring these examples forth and show the positive side of it. I think it does go back to ventilation, cross ventilation. It would be a way to mitigate the harsh climate, as Stephen was mentioning before. We don't have to live with the air conditioning on the entire time. It could naturally ventilate, and a courtyard and this type of the row house, this typology would certainly help. And again, go back to creating the community, bringing that sort of fine-grained urbanism aspect to the city. So thank you for the question, Aki. Great, brought forth great comments. If we don't have any other questions or any final comments from anyone, we could start to wrap it up. Like I said initially, we should be sending out like a save the date, Colleen, for everyone to know about the event in October. The dates are the 7th and the 8th of October. Since you've registered, we now have your contact, so we could also maybe send an email about that. We'll see what happens if it's a virtual event in the end, but the theme is housing. So some of these topics that have come up in the questions and in the conversation will definitely be there in October.
We definitely will begin marketing the film festival actually starting on Monday. So start looking for all the information on it. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panelists, Rafael, Carrie, and Stephen, and Glenda. Thank you so much for putting this together. What a great program. Absolutely fascinating. And thank you all for being with us, and hope you can come to some of our other events. Now that we have your emails, we will send you information on what's coming up. Any last words, Glenda?
No, thank you, Colleen, too, for your support, and Cheryl as well, who couldn't be here with us. Same with Jason, who's the founder with me of this committee. If anyone is interested in knowing more or getting involved, please don't hesitate to reach out through the email or Instagram or wherever you're at. Thank you again to the panelists. Thank you very much, Rafael, for joining us from Japan, and Carrie and Stephen.
Greetings from Anagaya in Tokyo.
That's true.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Have a good night. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.